since there's no brown sugar in this recipe, I'm just going to put it back in the bag that it came in. And you can probably see in the bag, if you've measured it correctly, it holds its shape. It doesn't fall apart when you tip it out. That's one sign you've packed it in sufficiently. Storing brown sugar, since we're talking about it, you want to get all the air out of the bag and then close it like a potato chip bag so that it doesn't get hard over time. So I'm folding it down, and then I'm going to actually tape it with masking tape against itself so that there's no air in there, and it's nice and sealed, and it will be soft and flexible for the next time I want to use it. So it goes back in the box at that point. There are other tricks people use for brown sugar, but coming from a kitchen where we don't have time for gadgets, that works really well. In a professional world, we just seal it up like that. All right, so moving on to our wet ingredients. I've got pumpkin puree, and it's 100% pure pumpkin puree. You don't want pumpkin pie filling for this recipe. You want the pure pumpkin puree, which is actually a superfood full of antioxidants. And I'm going to measure this one on a scale. So pumpkin puree, also more of like a softer, semi-solid ingredient. A scale works really well for that. So this is a digital scale. There's balance scales also. For the digital scale, I'm going to turn it on, and you just give it a second to level out. It's going to stop moving its numbers, and then you put your container on there. So I'm going to use just a little deli cup, and that adds some weight to the scale. I don't know if you can see, but it says 0.6. I need to remove the weight of the container before I start measuring anything on a scale. So there's always a button that says tare, T-A-R-E, and tare means to remove the weight of whatever is sitting on top of the scale. So it zeroes it out again. So I'm going to push that once. My dial goes back to 0, and now I can add the weight of my pumpkin puree that I want, which is, for this recipe, 7.5 ounces. So I'm going to get our pumpkin spatula out, and I'm going to just add until I get to 7.5. And if I go a little bit over, I can always take it out. Measuring on a scale is the most precise way to measure anything, but Americans don't usually like using scales. I'm not sure why. It's a little bit of an extra piece of equipment, but it's actually much easier than using measuring cups and spoons. So I'm at 7.65. I'm just going to remove until I get down to 7.5 ounces. On the scale, it'll measure in different units of measure. So there'll always be a button that says mode, usually, and the mode you can just toggle between. This is going to show me pounds and ounces. This one is just pounds, so this is almost half a pound. This one is grams in the metric system, kilograms, just the larger unit of measure, and then back to ounces. So I want to make sure that I'm in the correct unit of measure, which is specified on the dial. It says OZ there. If we look at it, you can see. And then there's our mode button for changing the unit of measure and our tare button. I don't use any of those other buttons, except the power button sometimes, to turn it off. So those are the two buttons on any digital scale that you want to know how to use. How to remove the weight of the container, how to make sure you're in the mode that the recipe is written in. So this recipe was written in ounces. I want to be in the ounces mode. So I've got my 7.5 ounces of pumpkin puree there. Turn my scale off and take it away. The other note about scales is you never want it touching anything else, because it leaning against something could mess up the weight. So it has to be its own island. Okay, so save the rest of that pumpkin puree for something else, maybe pumpkin waffles, and we'll go for our liquids. So 2 eggs I'm going to add in a minute, but to my wet ingredients, I want to use what's called a liquid measuring cup. So it has cups on one side and milliliters on the other side, which is metric, and the imperial or standard system, which is pretty much only used in the United States and a couple other countries in the world. Almost everyone uses metric, but we don't. So I want to always be able to see the lines. If they've worn off, you need to replace your container. And I'm going to go with 1/4 cup each of vegetable oil or canola oil and orange juice in this recipe. And the important thing to note when you're measuring liquid ingredients is it's always a clear container, because we want to get to eye level with the top line of the liquid. And if I was using a dry measuring cup for that, it would spill over. It would, like, any movement would cause it to spill and me to make a mess. So that's why we have a different tool. The dry ingredients, you can't measure in here because you can't level off inside the container. So it works for wets and those work for dries, and the two never should cross. So I'm going to go 1/4 cup of my orange juice, and I actually will squat down and get it eye level with the line. So the first line on my liquid measuring cup is a 1/4 cup. So I want to be right exactly level with the line. And I don't want to hold it up in the air because it's sloshing. I'm not going to get an accurate measurement. Someone's leaning. I don't want to check the measurement from up here because from here it actually looks like I have too much liquid. That looks like it's above the line, but that's not true. When you get down and look at the meniscus, which is what we talk about in science labs, it's exactly level with the line. That's what I want. So I'm going to add my canola or vegetable oil, another 1/4 cup. So 1/4 plus 1/4 is going to bring me to a 1/2 cup line. Just go easy. There we go. Double check. Measure twice. Don't make a mistake. So I've got those in there. I'm going to add my eggs to this now. So I'm going to do my single tap on a flat surface to not get shell. Drop it in there. Drop it in. If you get any shell in your liquid, the eggshell itself is great for catching that shell. It's attracted to itself for some reason, where it wants to run away from your finger or a spoon. It's gonna kind of be almost like stuck to itself if you had any little pieces in there to get out. But make sure you check, see if you have any. Little pieces will sink to the bottom, and actually I didn't think I had one, but I have one right there. So I do need to get that out. Funny enough. So I'm going to take the edge of my eggshell. I'm going to look for that piece. This is kind of deep. It's going to be a little bit of a trick. I'm going to go down, and it's going to try and float up to the shell. Let's see. So attract it to him. A little bit tedious. Sometimes if you have a lot, you have to pour it into a different container to get it out. Oh, so close, so close. That shell failed me. I'm going to pour it into a different container. It's a little bit wider. This is what really happens in baking. You just gotta recover. Okay, so now I can see it much more easily. Let's see if I can get the camera. I can't touch it with my hand while I've got egg on my hand. So I'm just going in the edge. That actually works super easy. And it's right there caught on the edge of the shell. So I just kind of scooped it up against the side and it wants to be trapped there. So now I can throw that away, wash my hands because they have egg on them, and proceed. All right, I was gonna mix everything in my liquid measuring cup, but since I've got this bowl in action now, I will use that. So I'm just gonna scrape any extra liquids out of my liquid measuring cup. One of the principles of baking is to scrape everything out so that you're not leaving part of your formula behind to go in the sink. So we've got that, and then our pumpkin is gonna be added to it. And I'm gonna whisk everything together. So what I'll be left with is all of my dry ingredients in the first bowl I did, and all of my wet ingredients in the second bowl. And that actually is going to be the beginnings of what we call the muffin mixing method for quick breads. So what we're doing is making a quick bread. Any cupcake, muffin, scone, those are all called quick breads because they actually come together really quickly. All right, so I'm going to whisk, and I'll keep talking about that. Just want to make sure those eggs are totally incorporated with everything else. At this stage, when the liquids are by themselves, is my opportunity to get it totally smooth. I can use as much whisking as I want right now to blend those ingredients together. So I mentioned quick breads. They're called quick breads because they come together quickly, fast. That is because they use a chemical leavener to rise. So that's our baking soda or baking powder in another recipe. As opposed to yeast or complicated pastry techniques like we use for puff pastry. And so it's a really fast recipe. You can have a finished product in, 30 to 60 minutes. It has an instant rise from a chemical reaction. So the baking soda is going to react with the acid, excuse me, with the liquid in this recipe. Baking powder would react with an acid and a liquid. And it gives us gas bubbles that cause the product to become light and fluffy. So we love that. All right, so I've got my wets. Over here I've got my dries, and now the two are going to become combined. In the muffin method for mixing, you mix those two elements separately, and then we put them together with as little agitation as possible. So when I'm going to combine them, I'm going to fold with my spatula instead of using a whisk, and that is going to moisten all the dry ingredients but not overwork them. And if I keep mixing and whisking, it's actually going to create a tough muffin. If you ever had a muffin that was kind of bouncy, like a sponge or a spring, or had a rubbery texture, it was overmixed. If you see tunnels of air pockets through the muffin after you take a bite in it, that was also overmixed. Because what's happening is there's protein strands in the flour, and when they get wet, they become like rubber bands. And the more you mix it, the more tangled the rubber bands become, like a ball of rubber bands. And it becomes tougher and tougher the more you mix it. So we have a small window of opportunity to get things combined. We want to do it effectively. So I am going to make a well sort of in the center of my dry ingredients, just a little hole to tip my liquids into. So I'm going to scrape with my rubber spatula or silicone spatula, whichever you have, all of my liquids, clean out that bowl so it's got no ingredient left in it, into that. And then I'm going to start folding. And folding is a technique in and of itself. I'm going to grip my spatula sort of in the middle of the handle. I'm going to cut through the center of my ingredients. I'm going to scrape the bottom and fold what was on the bottom onto the top. I turn the bowl and I keep going. So I'm going to cut, scrape, and turn. And what I'm doing is actually drawing the letter J with my arm. So I'm making a letter J. And I'm going to fold. Okay. And you keep doing that until everything is combined. So you can scrape the outside once in a while and kind of collect it so that it's getting incorporated also. And this makes a pretty thick batter, but you'll see as the baking soda starts to activate, it's going to start to look a little bit fluffier as we create gas bubbles from our baking soda when it gets wet from our wet ingredients. All right, so the muffin method means to fold it together until it is just combined and you have no more pockets of dry ingredients, but it can still be a little bit lumpy. So I feel like I'm there right now. I don't have any more pockets of dry, but it doesn't look perfectly smooth. If I kept folding or if I whisked until it was perfectly smooth, I would have tough muffins. So that's scraped off my spatula, and then we're going to be ready to go into our baking pan.